Sarah Mitchell had lived in the small town of Millbrook her entire life, working as a librarian at the public library on Main Street for the past 12 years. She was the kind of person who blended into the background of community life, always helpful and kind, but never drawing attention to herself. At 38 years old, she lived alone in a modest cottage at the edge of town, spending her evenings reading books and tending to her small garden. The people of Millbrook knew her as a quiet, unremarkable woman who stamped their books with a gentle smile and occasionally recommended a good mystery novel. What they didn't know was that Sarah carried within her a secret talent that she had kept hidden for more than 2 decades. Growing up in Millbrook, Sarah had been an unusually gifted child when it came to music. Her mother, a piano teacher who gave lessons from their home, had recognized Sarah's natural ability when she was just 4 years old. While other children struggled to pick out simple melodies with one finger, Sarah could hear a song once and reproduce it perfectly on the piano keys. By the time she was 8, she was playing complex classical pieces that students twice her age found challenging. Her mother had dreams of Sarah attending a prestigious music conservatory, perhaps even becoming a concert pianist who would travel the world performing in grand halls. But life in a small town like Millbrook had a way of setting expectations that were hard to escape. Sarah's father worked at the local hardware store and believed that artistic pursuits were fine as hobbies but impractical as careers. He wanted Sarah to focus on getting a solid education that would lead to a stable job, something sensible and reliable. When Sarah was 16, her mother passed away suddenly from a heart condition that no one had known she had. The loss devastated Sarah and left her feeling unmoored. The piano in their living room, which had been the center of so much joy and connection with her mother, became a painful reminder of everything she had lost. Sarah's father, grieving in his own way, couldn't bear to hear piano music in the house anymore. He asked Sarah to stop playing at least for a while until the wound wasn't so fresh. That temporary pause stretched into months, then years. Sarah went to community college and got her degree in library science, following a path that felt safe and predictable. She took the job at the Millbrook Public Library and settled into a quiet routine. The piano still sat in her father's house, covered with a sheet, gathering dust in the corner of the living room. Sarah would sometimes visit her father and see that covered shape, feeling a pang of longing mixed with an ache too deep to examine closely. Over the years, Sarah convinced herself that she had moved on from music. She told herself that her teenage dreams of being a pianist had been childish fantasies, that she had made the right choice in pursuing a practical career. Whenever she heard piano music on the radio or in a movie, she would feel her fingers twitch involuntarily, muscle memory responding to melodies even after all this time. But she pushed those feelings down, maintaining the careful composure of someone who had accepted their lot in life without complaint or regret. Her co-workers at the library saw her as pleasant but reserved, someone who never shared much about her personal life or her past. The Millbrook Community Center was a bustling hub of activity in the small town, hosting everything from yoga classes to town hall meetings. In late October, the center was preparing for its annual fundraiser, a casual event where local businesses donated items for a silent auction and community members gathered for food, music, and socializing. Sarah had volunteered to help with setup, as she often did for community events. She wasn't particularly social, but she liked feeling useful and contributing to the town that had been her home for her entire life. On the day before the fundraiser, Sarah arrived at the community center to help arrange tables and chairs. The main hall was a large open space with hardwood floors and high ceilings, and it echoed with the sounds of people working to transform it into a party venue. Decorations were being hung, a small stage was being assembled for a local band that would perform, and various items for the auction were being displayed on tables around the perimeter. Sarah was carrying a stack of folding chairs when she noticed something in the corner of the room that made her stop in her tracks. There, pushed against the far wall, was an old upright piano that Sarah had never seen before. It looked like it had been through decades of hard use and neglect. The wood finish was scratched and faded, several of the white keys were chipped or yellowed with age, and one of the black keys appeared to be missing entirely. Someone had placed a handwritten sign on top of it that read "Free to Good Home" with a phone number scrawled below. The piano looked sad and abandoned, a relic from another era that no one wanted anymore. Sarah set down her stack of chairs and found herself drawn toward the instrument despite her better judgment. She hadn't touched a piano in over 20 years, had actively avoided them whenever possible to prevent the flood of memories and emotions they triggered. But something about this neglected piano called to her, perhaps because it looked as forgotten and dismissed as she sometimes felt. She approached it slowly, running her hand along the dusty surface, feeling the worn wood beneath her fingertips. Tom Bradford, one of the community center volunteers and a local real estate agent known for his boisterous personality and tendency toward practical jokes, noticed Sarah standing by the piano. Tom was the kind of person who loved being the center of attention and got his entertainment from teasing others in ways he thought were good-natured, but often crossed the line into mean-spiritedness. He had always seen Sarah as an easy target, someone too quiet and polite to push back against his jokes. Tom walked over with a broad grin on his face, already chuckling at whatever idea had formed in his mind. He called out loudly enough for the other volunteers to hear, announcing that they had discovered a hidden talent in their midst. He told everyone that quiet little Sarah from the library was going to entertain them with a concert on this magnificent instrument. His tone was heavily sarcastic, and several people laughed at the absurdity of the suggestion. The piano was clearly broken, barely functional, and the idea that reserved Sarah Mitchell would suddenly perform for an audience was ridiculous. Sarah felt her face flush with embarrassment as attention turned toward her. She tried to politely decline, explaining that she didn't play piano, but Tom wasn't about to let his joke die so easily. He made an exaggerated show of pulling out the piano bench and gesturing for Sarah to sit down like she was a concert soloist about to perform at Carnegie Hall. Other volunteers were watching now, some amused by Tom's antics and others feeling uncomfortable with how he was putting Sarah on the spot. A few people urged her to just play anything, probably expecting her to fumble through a simple children's song and give everyone a good laugh. Sarah stood frozen, torn between her instinct to flee from this humiliating situation and a strange pull toward the piano that she couldn't quite explain. Part of her wanted to refuse outright and walk away, to maintain the safe distance she had kept from music for so many years. But another part of her, a part she had tried to bury, was whispering that maybe this was a chance for something, though she couldn't articulate exactly what. Her hands were trembling slightly as she looked at the piano's damaged keys and thought about how long it had been since she had played anything at all. Tom was still making jokes, telling the gathered volunteers that they were about to witness the performance of a lifetime, his voice dripping with mockery. Someone else chimed in that the piano probably didn't even work properly, that half the keys were likely dead. The laughter in the room felt cruel to Sarah, even though she knew most of these people weren't trying to be mean. They simply saw an awkward situation orchestrated by Tom and didn't know how to respond. Sarah felt small and exposed, just as she had felt at various moments throughout her careful, quiet life. But then something shifted inside her. Maybe it was the accumulated weight of 20 years of silence and suppressed longing. Maybe it was anger at being made the butt of Tom's joke in front of her neighbors. Maybe it was simply that seeing this broken, discarded piano reminded her too much of how she sometimes felt about herself. Whatever the reason, Sarah found herself walking to the piano bench and sitting down with a composure that surprised even her. She positioned her hands over the keys, and in that moment, muscle memory from thousands of hours of childhood practice came flooding back into her body like a river breaking through a dam. Sarah's fingers hovered over the damaged keys for just a moment, and she could feel the weight of everyone's eyes on her back. The room had gone quieter, with people pausing their work to watch what they assumed would be an embarrassing spectacle. Tom Bradford stood off to the side with his arms crossed and a smug grin on his face, clearly enjoying the discomfort he had created. Sarah took a slow breath and let her fingers settle onto the keys, feeling their familiar shape beneath her touch despite the chips and wear. Even through the damage, she could sense the piano waiting, as if it too had been silent for too long. She pressed down gently on a few keys, testing them. Several notes came out sounding tinny and out of tune, confirming what everyone could see just by looking at the instrument. The middle C stuck slightly when she played it, requiring extra pressure to make any sound at all. Two keys in the upper register produced nothing but dull thuds, their internal hammers clearly broken or disconnected. The missing black key left an obvious gap that would make certain passages impossible to play as written. This piano was in terrible condition, barely functional, exactly the kind of instrument that would be offered for free because it wasn't worth the cost of repair. But Sarah had learned piano on an instrument not much better than this one during the early years before her mother could afford something nicer. She knew how to work around broken keys, how to adjust her playing to compensate for mechanical failures, how to coax music from imperfect tools. More importantly, the music lived in her mind and her hands, not in the instrument itself. A great pianist could make even a broken piano sing if they understood how to listen to what it could still do rather than mourning what it couldn't. Sarah closed her eyes and let her mind drift back to a piece she had loved as a teenager, Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata. It was a challenging piece that had taken her months to master under her mother's patient guidance. She could still remember sitting beside her mother on their piano bench, her mother's gentle corrections and encouraging words helping Sarah navigate the complex passages. The memory brought a sharp ache to her chest, but instead of pushing it away as she had done for 20 years, Sarah let herself feel it fully. She let the grief and love and longing flow through her and into her fingers. The first notes rang out across the community center hall, and they were nothing like what anyone had expected. Despite the piano's poor condition, Sarah's touch brought forth sounds that were hauntingly beautiful. She navigated around the broken keys seamlessly, adjusting the melody in ways that only a truly skilled musician would know how to do. Where notes were missing, she filled in with careful improvisation that honored the spirit of the original composition. Where the piano sounded harsh or tinny, she adjusted her dynamics to work with the instrument's limitations rather than against them. The transformation in the room was immediate and total. The laughter and chatter died away completely as people stopped what they were doing and turned to face Sarah. Tom Bradford's smug expression faltered and then disappeared entirely, replaced by a look of genuine shock. Volunteers who had been hanging decorations lowered their arms and stood motionless. Someone who had been dragging a table across the floor stopped mid-motion, not wanting to create any noise that might disturb what they were hearing. The broken piano, which moments ago had been an object of derision and pity, was producing music that seemed to fill every corner of the space. Sarah kept her eyes closed, lost in the piece and in memories that came flooding back with each measure. She remembered her mother's face as she listened to Sarah practice, the pride and joy that would light up her features when Sarah mastered a difficult passage. She remembered summer evenings playing piano while her mother prepared dinner, the music mixing with the smell of cooking and the golden light streaming through their kitchen window. She remembered her mother's hands, gentle and strong, guiding her own smaller hands across the keys, teaching her not just technique but how to pour emotion into every note. As Sarah moved through the sonata, her playing grew more confident and powerful. Her fingers flew across the keys with the kind of precision that came only from years of serious training. She made split-second decisions about how to modify phrases to accommodate the broken keys, doing it so smoothly that anyone who didn't know the piece intimately would never guess she was improvising. The emotion in her playing was raw and real, the sound of someone who had kept feelings bottled up for far too long finally allowing them to pour out. Margaret Chen, the director of the community center and a woman in her 60s who had lived in Millbrook her whole life, stood near the entrance with tears streaming down her face. She had known Sarah since she was a child and had even attended a few recitals that Sarah's mother had organized before her death. Margaret had always wondered what happened to that talented little girl, why she had never pursued music. Now, listening to this extraordinary performance emerging from a broken piano in a community center, Margaret felt like she was witnessing something sacred, a resurrection of sorts. The other volunteers remained frozen in place, barely breathing, as Sarah continued to play. A young woman named Jessica, who worked at the local coffee shop and had always dismissed Sarah as boring and unremarkable, felt goosebumps rising on her arms. She had taken piano lessons as a child and quit after a year because she found it tedious. But listening to Sarah play, she suddenly understood what music could be when someone truly connected with it. This wasn't just technical skill, though Sarah's technique was clearly exceptional. This was art, raw and honest and deeply human. Tom Bradford stood completely still, his earlier mockery transformed into something that looked almost like shame. He had meant to embarrass Sarah, to get some laughs at her expense with his cruel joke about playing the broken piano. Instead, he had accidentally created the circumstances for her to reveal a talent so profound that it made everyone in the room reassess everything they thought they knew about her. Tom's face had gone red, and he seemed to shrink into himself, suddenly aware of how small and mean his joke had been compared to the beauty Sarah was creating. Sarah played on, unaware of the impact she was having on her audience. She had fallen completely into the music, her body moving with the phrases, her face showing every emotion the piece evoked. When she reached the crescendo of the second movement, her hands attacked the keys with a passionate intensity that made the damaged piano shake slightly. Notes that were out of tune somehow added to the emotional impact rather than detracting from it, giving the performance a quality of beautiful brokenness that perfectly matched the piece's melancholic nature. As Sarah transitioned into the final movement, building toward the powerful conclusion of the sonata, more people began gathering near the hall. A custodian who had been working in another part of the building heard the music and came to investigate. Two women who had been setting up refreshments in the kitchen stepped into the doorway, their task forgotten. Even outside the community center, a few passers-by stopped on the sidewalk, drawn by the sound of piano music drifting through the open windows. Sarah reached the final measures of the piece, the triumphant notes that brought the sonata to its powerful close. Her hands moved with absolute certainty across the keys, claiming the music as her own despite the years of separation from it. She played the last chord and let it ring out, sustaining it until the sound finally faded into silence. Only then did she open her eyes and lift her hands from the keys, suddenly remembering where she was and what had just happened. The silence that followed lasted only a heartbeat before the room erupted. The applause started immediately, loud and genuine, and filled with astonishment. People weren't just clapping politely as they might for any community performance. They were clapping with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for professional concerts, their faces showing genuine awe. Margaret Chen was openly crying, not bothering to wipe away her tears. Jessica from the coffee shop was clapping so hard her hands hurt. Even the custodian who barely knew Sarah was shaking his head in amazement. Sarah turned on the piano bench to face the room, and the look of shock on her own face suggested she was just as surprised by what had happened as everyone else. Her hands were shaking, and her eyes were bright with unshed tears. She seemed to be struggling to process the reaction she was receiving, as if she couldn't quite believe that what she had just done was worthy of such response. For someone who had spent 2 decades trying to be invisible, suddenly being the center of this kind of attention was overwhelming. Tom Bradford stepped forward, and for a moment, Sarah tensed, expecting another joke or some comment that would diminish what had just occurred. But Tom's face was serious, almost humble as he approached her. He apologized in front of everyone, his voice subdued and genuine. He said he had been completely wrong about her, that he had meant to embarrass her, but instead she had given everyone an incredible gift. He admitted that his joke had been mean-spirited and that he was sorry for putting her on the spot. The apology clearly cost him something, coming from a man who prided himself on never taking anything too seriously. Sarah accepted Tom's apology with a quiet nod, still too overwhelmed to find many words. As she stood up from the piano bench, her legs felt unsteady, as if the act of playing had drained something essential from her. Margaret Chen rushed over and wrapped Sarah in a tight embrace, whispering that the performance had been absolutely beautiful. Other volunteers crowded around, all wanting to express their amazement and ask questions. Where had Sarah learned to play like that? Why had she never mentioned being a pianist? Would she consider performing at the fundraiser tomorrow night instead of just helping with setup? The questions came too fast for Sarah to answer, and she felt herself becoming flustered by the sudden attention. She tried to explain that she had studied piano as a child but hadn't played in over 20 years, that she didn't consider herself a pianist anymore, that what they had just witnessed was a fluke brought on by emotion and muscle memory. But the people gathered around her weren't buying these self-deprecating explanations. They had ears and they knew what they had heard. That kind of playing didn't come from rusty skills or lucky muscle memory. That came from genuine talent that had been dormant but never truly gone. Jessica from the coffee shop pulled out her phone and admitted somewhat sheepishly that she had recorded the last part of Sarah's performance. She asked if it would be okay to share it on social media because people needed to hear this. Sarah's immediate instinct was to say no, to ask Jessica to delete the recording, to retreat back into the comfortable invisibility she had maintained for so long. But something stopped her from voicing that refusal. Maybe it was the look of genuine enthusiasm on Jessica's face, or maybe it was a small voice inside Sarah herself that was tired of hiding. Before Sarah could decide how to respond, Margaret took charge of the situation with the kind of gentle authority that came from years of managing community events and volunteers. She suggested that everyone give Sarah some space and get back to their set-up work, reminding them that they still had a lot to accomplish before tomorrow's fundraiser. She added that they could talk more about the possibility of Sarah performing at the event, but that decision should be Sarah's to make without pressure. The crowd reluctantly dispersed, though Sarah could hear them talking excitedly among themselves as they returned to their tasks. Margaret guided Sarah to a quiet corner of the hall and sat down with her at one of the tables that had been set up for the auction. She held Sarah's hands and looked at her with a mixture of concern and curiosity. In a gentle voice, Margaret asked Sarah what had happened, why someone with such extraordinary talent had kept it hidden for so long. Sarah found herself opening up in a way she rarely did, telling Margaret about her mother's death and her father's request that she stop playing, about how the silence had stretched from months into years until playing piano felt like something from another life entirely. Margaret listened with the kind of patience that came from truly caring about someone's story. When Sarah finished speaking, Margaret was quiet for a moment before sharing her own memory. She told Sarah that she remembered attending a recital when Sarah was about 15, not long before her mother passed away. Sarah had played a Chopin nocturne, and Margaret had been struck by the maturity and depth of feeling in such a young performer's interpretation. She had thought at the time that Sarah was destined for something special in the music world. When Sarah's mother died and the recitals stopped, Margaret had assumed Sarah was grieving and would eventually return to music. The years passed and Sarah never did, and Margaret had always wondered but never felt it was her place to ask. Hearing this perspective from someone who had known her mother and witnessed her earlier promise made Sarah's emotions surge again. She had convinced herself that her teenage dreams of being a pianist had been unrealistic, that she had never been as good as her mother's pride had made her believe. But Margaret's memory suggested otherwise. Maybe Sarah had given up something real and valuable, not just a childish fantasy. The thought was both painful and strangely liberating, as if a door she had believed to be permanently locked was actually just closed, waiting to be opened. Margaret gently raised the question of whether Sarah might consider playing at tomorrow's fundraiser. She explained that the local band scheduled to perform was fine but not particularly exciting, and having Sarah play piano would make the event much more special. She promised it could be low-key, just a few pieces during the reception hour before dinner, nothing formal or intimidating. Sarah's immediate instinct was to refuse, to insist that tonight had been a one-time thing and she needed to retreat back to her normal life. But even as these thoughts formed, she felt them weakening against a growing desire to say yes. The truth was that playing piano again after 20 years had awakened something in Sarah that she hadn't realized was sleeping. The physical sensation of her hands on the keys, the mental challenge of navigating the music, the emotional release of expressing herself through sound rather than just existing quietly in the background of life. All of it had felt like coming home to a part of herself she had abandoned. The broken piano had been a perfect metaphor for how Sarah felt about her own life, damaged and dismissed and pushed into a corner. But she had made that piano sing despite its brokenness, and maybe that meant something about her own potential too. Sarah surprised herself by agreeing to play at the fundraiser. The words came out hesitantly, qualified with concerns about her rustiness and warnings that she might not perform as well as she had tonight. But Margaret's face lit up with such genuine joy that Sarah felt a warmth spread through her chest. Margaret promised to take care of all the details, to make sure Sarah felt comfortable and supported. She also mentioned that the community center had a slightly better piano in storage, an old Yamaha upright that was in better condition than the broken instrument Sarah had just played. They could bring it out for the fundraiser so Sarah wouldn't have to work around missing keys. As Sarah finally prepared to leave the community center that evening, she walked past the broken piano one more time. She ran her hand along its scarred surface and felt an unexpected affection for this damaged instrument that had been the catalyst for such an unexpected turn of events. Tom's cruel joke, meant to humiliate her, had instead broken through the careful walls Sarah had built around her musical self. Sometimes, she realized, the things meant to hurt us could accidentally set us free instead. On her drive home through the quiet streets of Millbrook, Sarah's mind was racing. She thought about what pieces she might play at the fundraiser, mentally cataloging music she had once known by heart and wondering how much of it she could resurrect with one day of practice. She thought about her father and whether she should tell him about what had happened. They had never really talked about why she stopped playing piano, had simply let that subject remain buried along with their shared grief over her mother's death. Maybe it was time to have that conversation. When Sarah arrived at her cottage, she went straight to the small closet in her bedroom where she kept boxes of old belongings she rarely looked through. She dug past winter clothes and holiday decorations until she found what she was looking for, a cardboard box labeled music in her teenage handwriting. Inside were sheet music books, recital programs, certificates from piano competitions, and photographs from performances. Sarah sat on her bedroom floor and went through these artifacts from her past life. And it felt like looking at a stranger, this confident young pianist who had believed music would be her future. One photograph in particular caught Sarah's attention. It showed Sarah at 14, seated at a piano during a competition, her face intense with concentration. Her mother stood in the background of the photo, partially out of frame, but Sarah could see the pride radiating from her expression. Sarah held the photo carefully, studying her mother's face, and for the first time in years she let herself remember the good parts without immediately drowning in the pain of loss. Her mother had loved hearing her play. Giving up piano hadn't honored her mother's memory as Sarah had somehow convinced herself. If anything, it had buried one more beautiful thing along with her. Sarah set the photograph aside and began sorting through her sheet music, looking for pieces that might work for tomorrow's performance. Her hands trembled slightly as she turned pages, seeing markings and notes in her own youthful handwriting, evidence of hours spent practicing and perfecting. She found several pieces that felt right, music that was beautiful and accessible, not too technically demanding given her long absence from regular practice, but substantial enough to showcase real musicianship. She made a stack of selected pieces and carried them to her kitchen table, where she could review them more carefully. Sarah barely slept that night. She lay in bed running through piano pieces in her mind, her fingers moving slightly against the blanket as if playing invisible keys. She felt anxious about the commitment she had made to perform at the fundraiser, worried that tonight's success might have been a fluke, and tomorrow she would embarrass herself in front of the entire town. But underneath the anxiety was something else, a current of excitement she hadn't felt in years. She was nervous in the way performers get nervous before important moments, and that feeling itself was precious because it meant she was allowing herself to care about something again. The next morning, Sarah woke early and made a decision that surprised her. She drove across town to her father's house, a modest ranch-style home where she had grown up. Her father, Robert Mitchell, was in his garage working on a woodworking project when she arrived. He looked up with surprise when Sarah walked in, as she typically only visited on Sundays and it was Saturday morning. He asked if everything was okay, and Sarah told him she needed to talk to him about something important. They went inside to the kitchen, and Robert made coffee while Sarah gathered her courage. Sarah told her father about what had happened at the community center, about Tom's joke and the broken piano and the performance that had poured out of her unexpectedly. She watched her father's face carefully as she spoke, trying to gauge his reaction. Robert listened silently, his expression difficult to read. When Sarah mentioned that she had agreed to perform at the fundraiser tonight, her father set down his coffee cup and was quiet for a long moment. Sarah braced herself for disappointment or criticism, for him to remind her that music was an impractical pursuit. But instead, Robert's eyes filled with tears, which shocked Sarah because she had rarely seen her father cry. He told her that he had made a terrible mistake all those years ago when he asked her to stop playing piano. He explained that hearing music in the house had been too painful after Sarah's mother died because it reminded him so intensely of his wife. But he had never meant for Sarah to give up music entirely, had thought she would eventually return to it when the grief wasn't so fresh. When years passed and he hadn't known how to bring it up, how to tell her that he regretted his request without making her feel guilty for having honored it. Robert told Sarah that her mother would have been heartbroken to know that Sarah had abandoned piano. Her mother's greatest joy had been watching Sarah's talent blossom and imagining the future she might have as a musician. He said he had failed both his wife and his daughter by allowing his own pain to silence something beautiful. His voice broke as he apologized, saying he was sorry for taking that from her, and that if she was finding her way back to music now, even after all this time, he was grateful and proud. Sarah cried then, the kind of deep sobbing that comes from releasing years of accumulated grief and regret. Her father held her, and they grieved together properly for the first time since her mother's death, not just for the woman they had lost, but for all the ways that loss had diminished their lives. When the tears finally subsided, Robert asked Sarah if she would like to practice on their old piano, the one that had sat covered in the living room for 2 decades. Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice to speak. Robert led her to the living room and removed the sheet that had covered the piano for so long. Underneath, the instrument looked surprisingly well preserved, though it clearly needed tuning. Robert explained that he had maintained it over the years, keeping it clean and occasionally having it serviced, even though no one played it. He said he couldn't bear to get rid of it because it had been Sarah's mother's most prized possession. Sarah sat down at the familiar bench, and the moment felt momentous, like crossing a threshold she had been standing at for 20 years. She began to play through the pieces she had selected for the fundraiser performance, and despite the piano being out of tune, it felt like a homecoming. Her father sat in the armchair where he used to sit during her childhood practice sessions, and Sarah could almost imagine her mother there too, present in the music that filled the house once again. The wrong notes and mechanical imperfections didn't matter. What mattered was that the silence was finally broken, that the Mitchell house was hearing piano music again after far too long. Sarah practiced for several hours, taking breaks to rest her hands, which weren't accustomed to this much playing. Her father made lunch and they ate together, talking about her mother in ways they hadn't allowed themselves to do in years. Robert shared memories of meeting Sarah's mother, of how she had been playing piano at a church service when he first saw her, and how he had fallen in love partly because of the grace and passion he saw in her when she played. Sarah shared her own memories of lessons with her mother, of the patience and encouragement she had received, a feeling completely understood when they communicated through music. As afternoon approached and Sarah needed to head home to prepare for the fundraiser, her father walked her to her car. He told her he would be at the community center that evening, front row if possible, to hear her play. Sarah hugged him tightly, feeling closer to her father than she had in years. The conversation they had needed to have for 2 decades had finally happened, and while it couldn't give back the lost time, it opened the possibility of a different kind of future. Sarah went home and spent time getting ready with more care than she usually took. She chose a simple but elegant navy dress that she had worn to formal library events, styled her hair, and applied light makeup. Looking at herself in the mirror, she saw hints of that confident teenage pianist again, the girl who had believed she could do something meaningful with her life. That girl had been buried but not destroyed, and she was surfacing again, older and marked by loss but still fundamentally herself. When Sarah arrived at the community center that evening, the transformation of the space was complete. The hall looked festive and welcoming, with decorations hung, tables beautifully set, and the auction items displayed attractively. People were already arriving, dressed nicely for the fundraiser. Sarah noticed that the broken piano had been moved aside and replaced with the Yamaha upright Margaret had mentioned. It was clearly older but well-maintained, and when Sarah tested a few keys, she found it properly tuned and responsive. Margaret greeted Sarah warmly and introduced her to a few people from the fundraiser committee, explaining that Sarah would be providing live piano music during the reception hour. Sarah noticed that these introductions were made with a respect and attention she wasn't used to receiving. Usually when she attended community events, she was acknowledged politely but not treated as particularly important. Tonight, people seemed genuinely interested in talking to her, excited to hear her play. The shift in how she was being perceived was disorienting but not entirely unwelcome. As guests continued to arrive, and the hall filled with conversation and laughter, Sarah sat at the piano and began to play softly. She started with some gentle classical pieces that could serve as pleasant background music without overwhelming conversation. But even playing quietly, she noticed people turning to look at the piano, their conversations pausing as they registered the quality of what they were hearing. Word had apparently spread about yesterday's impromptu performance on the broken piano, and many people had come specifically hoping to hear Sarah play. Jessica from the coffee shop arrived with a group of friends, and Sarah saw her pointing toward the piano and talking excitedly. Tom Bradford came in looking somewhat subdued, and when he caught Sarah's eye, he gave her a respectful nod that seemed to carry lingering embarrassment about his joke. Margaret moved through the crowd greeting guests, but kept glancing toward Sarah with an expression of deep satisfaction, clearly pleased that her suggestion for Sarah to perform was working out beautifully. About halfway through the reception hour, the hall had filled considerably, and Margaret approached the piano to make an announcement. She asked for everyone's attention and then introduced Sarah properly, sharing a bit about her background and explaining that many people in the room had known Sarah for years without realizing she was an accomplished pianist. Margaret explained what had happened the previous day with the broken piano, and invited everyone to give Sarah their full attention for a few special pieces before dinner service began. The room quieted as Sarah prepared to transition from background music to a proper performance. She felt the familiar flutter of nerves that she remembered from childhood recitals, but this time the nervousness was mixed with something new, a sense of rightness about what she was doing. She had spent 20 years being invisible, and now she was choosing to be seen. The vulnerability of that choice was terrifying, but it was also exhilarating in a way that her safe, quiet life had never been. Sarah began with a piece by Chopin, the Nocturne in E-flat major that Margaret had remembered her playing as a teenager. Her fingers found the opening notes, and the melody unfolded with a liquid beauty that seemed to transform the atmosphere in the room. This was different from playing on the broken piano the day before. This instrument was properly maintained and tuned, and it responded to her touch with a richness and clarity that allowed the music to shine fully. Sarah felt herself relaxing into the performance, trusting her hands to remember what her conscious mind might have forgotten. The crowd was utterly silent now, everyone focused on Sarah and the music flowing from the piano. Her father had indeed secured a position near the front, and Sarah could see his face glowing with pride and emotion. Next to him sat Margaret, and near them were other longtime Millbrook residents who had known Sarah's mother and remembered her as a piano teacher. Some of these older community members had tears in their eyes, perhaps remembering Sarah as a young girl with exceptional promise, perhaps thinking of her mother and how she would have loved seeing this moment. When Sarah finished the Chopin piece, the applause was immediate and enthusiastic. She moved seamlessly into her next selection, a selection from Debussy's Sweet Bergamasque. The piece was both technically challenging and emotionally evocative, requiring delicate touch and careful dynamic control. Sarah poured herself into it, allowing the music to carry her through passages that were both beautiful and melancholic. She was no longer thinking about the audience or worrying about mistakes. She was simply inside the music, experiencing the pure joy of artistic expression that she had denied herself for far too long. As she played, Sarah became aware of a shift happening inside herself. For 20 years, she had defined herself by what she had lost and given up. She was the woman whose mother died, who abandoned her dreams, who settled for a quiet life of minimal risk and minimal reward. But sitting at this piano in front of her community, Sarah realized she could choose a different definition. She was someone who had survived loss and was finding her way back to joy. She was someone with genuine talent who was finally brave enough to share it. She was someone who could be both the practical librarian and the passionate musician, that those identities didn't have to be mutually exclusive. The Debussy piece built toward its conclusion, and Sarah played the final measures with a combination of technical precision and emotional depth that marked her as a serious artist, not just a talented amateur. When the last notes faded, there was a moment of silence before the applause erupted, louder and more sustained than before. People were standing, giving her an ovation that felt genuinely earned rather than politely obligatory. Sarah stood and took a small bow, her face flushed with pleasure and amazement at the response. Margaret returned to the piano to thank Sarah, and then she did something unexpected. She announced that several people had already approached her asking if Sarah offered private piano lessons, and would Sarah be willing to consider taking on students. The question caught Sarah completely off guard. She hadn't thought beyond tonight's performance, hadn't considered that this might open doors to a different kind of future. But as she looked around the room and saw the interested faces of parents with children, the eager expression of a few adults who mentioned they had always wanted to learn, Sarah found herself nodding yes before she had fully thought it through. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of congratulations and conversations. People wanted to talk to Sarah about lessons, about her background, about where she had been hiding this talent all these years. A reporter from the local newspaper asked if he could interview her for a feature story about hidden talents in the community. The owner of the town's only music store told her he would give her a generous discount on any sheet music or teaching materials she needed if she decided to start giving lessons. The attention was overwhelming but mostly positive, and Sarah tried to graciously accept the compliments while also staying grounded. Later in the evening, after dinner had been served and the auction was underway, Jessica found Sarah and showed her what had happened with the video she had posted online. The recording of Sarah playing the broken piano had been viewed thousands of times and shared widely across social media platforms. Comments poured in from people moved by the performance, by the backstory Jessica had included about the piano being broken and Sarah not having played in 20 years, and by what they described as the raw emotion in her playing. Several comments came from professional musicians who recognized genuine artistry when they heard it. Sarah felt strange looking at herself on a screen, watching this video that had somehow reached far beyond Millbrook. Part of her wanted to ask Jessica to take it down, uncomfortable with such public exposure. But another part of her recognized that this visibility might lead to opportunities she couldn't yet imagine. She thanked Jessica for sharing it, and tried not to think too much about the fact that thousands of strangers had now heard her play and formed opinions about her talent. As the fundraiser wound down and guests began departing, many stopped to speak with Sarah one more time. The evening had raised more money than previous years, and while the silent auction items deserved some credit, multiple people told Margaret that Sarah's performance had been the real draw. They said they would make this event an annual tradition if Sarah would agree to play each year. The assumption that she would be available and willing to perform again made Sarah realize that something fundamental had shifted. She was no longer invisible Sarah the librarian. She was becoming Sarah the pianist, at least in the eyes of her community. Sarah's father approached as she was packing up her sheet music, and he hugged her tightly without saying anything. Words weren't necessary. His presence throughout the evening, his visible pride and emotion, had communicated everything Sarah needed to know. He told her that her mother would have been so proud, and Sarah believed him. More importantly, she felt proud of herself, perhaps for the first time in her adult life. When Sarah finally left the community center that night, she carried with her a stack of contact information from people interested in lessons, business cards from local musicians wanting to collaborate, and invitations to perform at other upcoming events. The practical part of her mind was already worrying about how she would balance teaching piano with her full-time job at the library. But the artist part of her mind, the part that had been suppressed for 20 years, was simply rejoicing at being allowed to exist again. Driving home through the quiet streets of Millbrook, Sarah thought about how dramatically life could change in just 2 days. A cruel joke meant to humiliate her had instead become the catalyst for reclaiming a lost part of herself. The broken piano that was supposed to embarrass her had instead proven that real musicianship could transcend imperfect instruments. The community that had known her only as quiet, unremarkable Sarah now saw her as someone with depth and talent worth celebrating. None of this had been part of any plan. It had simply happened because she had chosen in one moment to be brave instead of safe. In the weeks following the fundraiser, Sarah's life transformed in ways both exciting and challenging. She did begin taking piano students, starting with just 3 children whose parents had contacted her that night. She gave lessons in the evenings and on weekends, working around her library schedule. Her father insisted she use the piano at his house, which he had professionally tuned and serviced. Teaching turned out to be deeply satisfying in unexpected ways. Sarah discovered she had inherited her mother's patience and gift for explaining musical concepts, and watching her students' progress brought her genuine joy. Word spread quickly through Millbrook about Sarah's teaching, and within a month she had a waiting list of prospective students. The income from lessons wasn't substantial, but it was enough to make a difference in Sarah's modest budget. More importantly, it gave her a connection to music that felt sustainable and integrated into her regular life, rather than being the all-or-nothing proposition she had imagined as a teenager. She didn't have to choose between practicality and artistry. She could be both a librarian and a piano teacher, both roles enriching the other. The local newspaper ran a feature story about Sarah with the headline "Hidden Talent Emerges from Broken Piano." The article told her story with sensitivity and included quotes from Margaret, her father, and several community members who had witnessed her performances. The reporter emphasized themes of resilience, second chances, and the importance of community arts programs. The article resonated with readers far beyond Millbrook, getting picked up by regional papers and shared widely online. Sarah received emails from people across the country who had similar stories of abandoned dreams and talents they had set aside for practical reasons. Some of these messages were simply expressions of appreciation for her story, inspiring them to reconnect with their own lost passions. But others came from musicians and music educators with concrete opportunities. A community college 2 towns over invited her to give a guest lecture about non-traditional paths in music education. A regional arts organization asked if she would perform at their annual benefit concert. A documentary filmmaker working on a project about amateur musicians wanted to include her story. Sarah was careful about which opportunities she accepted, not wanting to become overwhelmed or lose the balance she was working to establish. The most unexpected opportunity came from Victor Chen, Margaret's nephew, who was a music producer in Boston. He had seen the viral video of Sarah playing the broken piano and been genuinely impressed by her artistry. He reached out to ask if Sarah had ever considered recording an album. He explained that there was a growing market for albums by pianists with interesting backstories, musicians who played with authentic emotion rather than just technical perfection. He offered to produce a small album of Sarah playing classical pieces, recorded simply and honestly, capturing the quality that had made her viral video so compelling. Sarah's initial reaction was to dismiss the idea as absurd. She wasn't a professional concert pianist, hadn't trained at a conservatory, and didn't have the credentials that would make someone want to buy her recordings. But Victor persisted gently, explaining that the music industry was changing and that listeners increasingly valued authenticity over pedigree. The fact that she had lived a real life, had experienced loss and resilience, gave her interpretations a depth that many technically proficient but sheltered young pianists lacked. He wasn't promising fame or fortune, just a chance to create something beautiful and share it with people who might appreciate it. After discussing it with her father and Margaret, Sarah agreed to the recording project. They arranged to use a beautiful old church in a nearby town that had excellent acoustics and a well-maintained grand piano. The recording process was both nerve-wracking and magical. Sarah played pieces she had loved since childhood, and Victor captured them with minimal production, letting the natural sound of the piano and the space speak for itself. Between takes, Sarah told stories about what each piece meant to her, about her mother and their lessons together, and Victor recorded those too, planning to include some of the stories as liner notes. The album, titled simply After 20 Years, was released independently several months later. It wasn't a commercial blockbuster, but it found an audience. Music critics who reviewed it praised Sarah's emotional honesty and the maturity of her interpretations. The album sold steadily through online platforms, particularly after several popular music blogs featured it as an example of the beauty that could emerge from unconventional musical journeys. Sarah began receiving messages from listeners telling her how the music had touched them, how her story had encouraged them to pursue their own neglected passions. Perhaps more significant than any external success was how these changes affected Sarah's internal landscape. She no longer felt like she was living half a life, going through the motions of existence without truly engaging. The music had awakened her in ways that extended beyond just the piano. She found herself more present at work, more engaged with the library patrons she served. She started making changes in other areas of her life that she had let stagnate, redecorating her cottage, reconnecting with old friends, allowing herself to imagine a future that might include new relationships and experiences. Her relationship with her father deepened significantly. They spent time together at his house where she taught lessons and practiced, and their conversations ranged far beyond the polite surface topics they had stuck to for years. Robert began attending Sarah's performances and sitting in on some of her teaching sessions, his presence a quiet affirmation that he supported her fully. He told her once that watching her reclaim music had helped him heal from his own grief in ways he hadn't expected, that the house felt alive again in a way it hadn't since his wife died. About a year after the night of the broken piano, the community center held another fundraiser, and Sarah was asked to perform again. This time she arrived not as an invisible volunteer but as the featured entertainment, acknowledged on the event invitations and posters. She played on a beautiful grand piano that the community center had purchased partly with funds raised at the previous year's event. A purchase that Margaret said was directly inspired by Sarah's performance, proving how much good music could enhance community gatherings. The audience that night included many of Sarah's piano students and their families, her father beaming in the front row, Tom Bradford, who had become one of Sarah's most vocal supporters after his joke inadvertently changed her life, and visitors from surrounding towns who had heard about the remarkable pianist from Millbrook. Sarah played with confidence and joy, no longer fighting against years of suppressed emotion, but channeling her experiences into performances that were both technically accomplished and deeply moving. After her performance that night, a young girl about 10 years old approached Sarah shyly. She told Sarah that she was one of her piano students and that she used to think piano was boring until she started lessons with Sarah. Now she loved it and wanted to be a pianist when she grew up. She asked Sarah how she got so good at piano, and Sarah smiled, thinking about the complicated answer to that simple question. She told the girl that she practiced a lot when she was young, that she had wonderful teachers, and that she loved music more than almost anything. But then Sarah added something more, speaking to this young student but also to herself and to anyone else who might be listening. She said that sometimes life takes you away from the things you love, that circumstances and responsibilities can make you set aside your dreams for a while. But if something is truly part of who you are, it never completely disappears. It waits for you, sometimes for years, until you're ready to return to it. The broken piano had been waiting for someone to play it, and Sarah had been waiting for permission to be herself again, and somehow they had found each other at exactly the right moment. Sarah continued teaching, performing occasionally, and working at the library. She never became famous in any conventional sense, never played at Carnegie Hall or won major competitions. But she built a life that felt authentic and fulfilling, one where her various identities could coexist comfortably. The quiet librarian and the passionate musician weren't contradictions, but complementary aspects of who she was. Her students benefited from having a teacher who understood both the technical demands of music and the emotional courage required to share your art with others. The broken piano that had started everything was eventually repaired by a local craftsman who specialized in restoring old instruments. Sarah purchased it from the community center for a nominal fee, and it now sat in her cottage living room where she practiced and composed. She had grown fond of that piano and what it represented, how something damaged and dismissed could still create beauty if someone was willing to see its potential. Every time she played it, she remembered Tom's mocking challenge and how close she had come to walking away, to letting fear and practicality silence her one more time. Looking back years later, Sarah would recognize that night at the community center as a turning point not just in her relationship with music, but in her entire approach to life. She had spent 2 decades playing it safe, avoiding risk and vulnerability, keeping herself small and invisible to protect against hurt and disappointment. The broken piano had forced her to make a choice between safety and authenticity, and in choosing authenticity, she had discovered that the risks of being fully herself were far less painful than the cost of hiding. The people of Millbrook came to see Sarah differently too, not just as a talented pianist, but as a reminder that everyone carries hidden depths, that the quiet person you pass on the street might contain extraordinary gifts you would never guess at. Her story became part of local lore, told to newcomers as an example of their community's hidden treasures. And whenever someone felt stuck or resigned to a life that didn't quite fit, they would think of Sarah and the broken piano and remember that it's never too late to reclaim the parts of yourself you thought were lost forever.